He offered his jacket to a shivering woman at the bus stop, not knowing she was a CEO who would change his life forever. The wind cut through New York like a blade, snow falling steady from the gray sky, blanketing the sidewalks and quieting the city's usual roar. At a nearly deserted bus stop under a flickering street lamp, Henry stood hunched in a fraying olive jacket, clutching a warm manila folder tight to his chest. Inside were 5 resumes, 5 silent rejections. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog in the cold night air. 46 years old, former construction engineer, widower, father, and for now homeless. The thought landed heavily on him, like the snow piling at his feet. The red glow of a nearby pharmacy sign blinked 8:41 p.m. The bus was late. Cold had soaked through his worn boots. Then through the snow, a woman appeared. She looked 30-some in a business skirt and blouse. No coat, heels clicking on the pavement. Her wet hair clung to her face, arms wrapped tightly around herself. She stopped beneath the same awning, breath short, hands shaking. Henry tried not to stare, but her presence was striking, clean, polished, yet clearly suffering in the cold. She rubbed her bare hands together, failing to warm them. He looked away. Just another night, just another bus to nowhere. But then the wind howled. She flinched, curled inward, and Henry glanced at her again. His jacket wasn't much, but it was something. He could keep it, stay silent, be like everyone else. But he didn't. Without a word, he shrugged off the coat. The cold bit hard. He stepped toward her and held it out. Startled, she said, "You don't have to do that." Henry gave her a tired smile. "I've already lost enough today. This coat, it's the only thing I have left to give." She hesitated. "But you need it more than I do." Still, he gently draped it over her shoulders. Not tonight. The warmth startled her. It smelled of soap, maybe coffee. Comfort. She pulled it tighter without meaning to. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, folding his arms to keep warm. They stood in silence as the snow fell around them. After a moment, she turned to him. "What's your name?" "Henry." "I'm Claire." "Nice to meet you, Claire." She glanced at him. "You shouldn't have given me your jacket." He smiled faintly. "Probably not, but I couldn't just let you freeze." The low rumble of a bus broke the silence. Headlights pierced the snow as it pulled up. Claire moved toward it, then turned back. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Henry shrugged. "Somewhere," he said, not explaining it was the back seat of a rusted truck behind a warehouse. She reached into her purse and handed him a card. "In case you ever need anything," he took it, slipping it into his folder without looking. He didn't expect to use it. People said things like that all the time. Most didn't mean it. Claire stepped onto the bus, glanced back once more, the coat wrapped around her like armor. Henry watched until the bus disappeared into the snow. Alone again, he stood shivering, not from the cold, but from something else. Something small, quiet, powerful. He looked up at the sky, then down at the empty street. "Maybe tomorrow," he whispered, then turned and walked into the night. Henry walked slowly through the quiet back streets, snow crunching under his worn shoes. There was no need to hurry, no one waiting, no lights left on a window, just a cold familiarity of his truck parked behind an old warehouse on the edge of the city. He reached it just after 9. The old '98 Chevy was rusted, the heater long dead. Inside the front seat was a nest of blankets, a pillow in the corner, and a lunchbox tucked beneath the dashboard. He climbed in, shut the door, and sat in silence. From the glove compartment, he pulled out a small tin box and opened it. Inside was a faded photograph. His wife, Lily, smiling bright, and their son, Noah, around 7 with a crooked grin. "Good night, Lily," Henry whispered. "Good night, Noah." He leaned back, eyes on the ceiling, letting memories wash over him. He had once been Henry Miles' structural engineer. He built things, schools, homes, hospitals. He had a wife who taught kindergarten, laughed often, even when life was hard. Their son had her laugh, joyful and unfiltered. They weren't rich, but they were content. Then the cancer came. By the time they found it, it was already stage 4. Lily was gone in 9 months. Henry left his job to care for her. Afterward, everything unraveled. Bills piled up, savings drained. He sold a house, moved with Noah into smaller and smaller spaces, until there was nothing left but the truck. Still, he tried to shield his son. He turned the back seat into a spaceship, canned soup into adventures, a parking lot into their backyard. Every morning, he walked Noah to school, clean-shaven and with his shirt tucked in. "Why do you still cut your hair?" a shelter worker had once asked. Henry smiled. "Because my son needs to believe things can get better, and I need tea." Oh, look like I believe that too. He worked whatever jobs he could find. Moving furniture, fixing gutters, sweeping construction sites. It wasn't enough, but it kept them together until last fall. A social worker stepped in, said it wasn't safe, said Noah needed stability. Henry didn't argue. He knew they were right. Through blurry eyes, he signed the papers, hugged his son and promised, "Just for now, I'll come back for you." Since then, every day had been a climb. He sent resumes, stood in job fair lines, took notes at free workshops, studied codes at a library. He was building a plan slowly, quietly. Tonight had made that plan feel further than ever. Still sitting in his cold truck, rubbing his arms for warmth. He thought of Claire, the woman at the bus stop. How cold she'd looked. How surprised when he offered his coat. He didn't know why he'd done it. Maybe because she reminded him of Lily. Or maybe he just needed to feel like he could still do something good. That he was still a man who gave more than he took. Outside, the snow kept falling. Henry pulled a blanket over himself, leaned against the cold window, and shut his eyes. He didn't have much, but he still had himself. And for now, that would have to be enough. Claire stepped into the sleek lobby of her apartment building, the warmth inside wrapping around her like a soft blanket. The doorman greeted her with a polite nod, but she barely acknowledged him. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor as she made her way to the elevator, still wrapped tightly in the jacket the stranger had given her. She hadn't intended to take it. In fact, she had tried to refuse, but the man, Henry, he'd said, had insisted with a look in his eyes that quieted any further protest. Now, the jacket hung awkwardly on her, too large and threadbare, but warmer than anything she had worn in years. She stepped into her penthouse apartment on the 28th floor and was immediately greeted by silence. No television, no music, no laughter, just a hum of modern appliances and the distant howl of winter wind through thick glass windows. Claire dropped her purse on the entryway table and slowly peeled off the jacket. She was about to set it aside when her fingers brushed against something in the inner pocket. Curious, she reached in and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn, creased at the corners, smudged with fingerprints in time. She unfolded it carefully. It was a child's drawing done in crayon. 2 stick figures stood hand in hand under a crooked sun. One was labeled Dad, the other me. A small heart floated between them. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting were the words, "I love you, Daddy. Noah." Claire stood frozen. She stared at the drawing, the words blurring before her eyes. A tremor ran through her, and she sank onto the edge of her couch, jacket still in one hand, the picture in the other. Her throat tightened. Noah. The name stuck in her mind like a thorn. The way Henry had held the folder, the tiredness in his eyes, the weight in his voice. It all made sense now. This wasn't just a man who had given her his coat. This was a father who still carried a piece of his child close to his heart, a father who had nothing yet still chose to give. She looked around her apartment. The place was immaculate. High ceilings, designer furniture, glass walls, not a single photo frame or personal touch. A space designed for success, not warmth. Claire folded the drawing gently and placed it on her lap. Then, without thinking, she pulled the coat close and hugged it tightly to her chest. It still smelled faintly of something familiar. Maybe laundry detergent, maybe memory. And suddenly, without warning, tears welled up in her eyes. She hadn't cried in years. Not really. Not since she was a little girl. Cold and hungry, sitting on the steps of her church, hoping someone would notice her. That night, someone had, a man with kind eyes and a weathered face. He had taken off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. He hadn't said much, just smiled and told her she'd be okay. It had been the first act of kindness she remembered, the first time she felt seen. She never saw the man again, but that moment changed everything. Claire sniffed and wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. She wasn't the same girl anymore. She had clawed her way out of the foster system, worked through college on scholarships in sheer determination, built Infinity Group from a single app idea to one of the most influential tech companies on the East Coast. She had earned every dollar, every accolade. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten what it meant to need, what it meant to give. Tonight, a stranger reminded her. She looked again at the drawing, at the shaky little heart between the stick figures, then at the coat in her arms, too big, too worn, but heavy with meaning. And for the first time in a very long time, Claire Langston cried, not because she was broken, but because Omething inside her had been gently, beautifully cracked open. The next morning, Claire sat at her desk, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside her. The skyline stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, but her eyes were fixed on the crumpled drawing in her hand. The edges were worn now from being unfolded and folded again, as if she were trying to memorize every stroke of crayon. She had barely slept. She kept replaying the night before, the way Henry had offered his only coat without hesitation, the quiet dignity in his voice, the pain behind his tired smile. Something about him haunted her, not just the kindness, but the sorrow he tried so hard to hide. She reached into the top drawer of her desk and pulled out a small silver bell. Moments later, her assistant, Rachel, stepped in. "Yes, Miss Langston. I need you to help me find someone," Claire said, her tone calm but firm. Rachel blinked. "Of course, who?" Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second. "His name is Henry. I don't have a last name. He was at the 56 and Madison bus stop last night around 8:30. He gave me his jacket. I want to find him." Rachel looked surprised, but she nodded. "I'll see what I can do." And Rachel, this stays between us. Over the next few days, Claire's instructions were carried out with quiet efficiency. Her team, used to locating elusive developers and poach executives, now turned their skills toward piecing together the life of a man who lived in the shadows. They pulled traffic camera footage from the nearest intersections. Henry's figure appeared briefly, blurred, and bundled in his jacket. They traced the bus routes that stopped in that area around the time Claire boarded. Cross-referenced with entry logs, they narrowed down a handful of potential riders. None of them matched corporate databases. Finally, Rachel returned with a thin folder. "His name is Henry Miles," she said. "It used to be a structural engineer. No recent employment records. I found some online forum posts asking about job openings. He listed a contact number linked to a prepaid phone. No permanent address." Claire flipped through the pages. A copy of an old driver's license photo. A LinkedIn profile frozen in time. A scan of a construction license that had long since expired. No arrest records, no scandals, just absence. Claire closed the folder. The silence in the room felt heavy. "Where's he now?" Rachel shifted. "One of our guys spotted him yesterday near the south end of the Bronx. There's an old pickup truck parked behind a warehouse. He's been seen coming and going, sleeping in it." Claire stood. "I won't go there." Rachel hesitated. "Claire, you sure? We could arrange for someone to approach him or bring him here." "No," Claire interrupted. "This isn't a meeting. It's personal." Rachel said nothing, but her eyes softened. "I'll have someone drive you." An hour later, Claire sat in the back seat of a black sedan as it was way through streets far removed from boardrooms and glass towers. They passed shuttered storefronts, graffiti-covered walls, and people who moved with heads down against the cold. The driver pulled up near the warehouse. Claire saw it immediately. The old Chevy tucked into the shadows. Snow piled up around its tires. It looked like it hadn't moved in days. She stepped out into the chill. The air smelled like rust and damp concrete. Her heels crunched softly on the gravel as she walked slowly toward the truck. Through the windshield, she could just make out a figure in the front seat. As she got closer, the door creaked open. Henry stepped out, blinking in the daylight. He looked at her with confusion at first, then recognition. His expression shifted. Puzzlement, caution, then something like embarrassment. "Claire," he said. his voice rough with sleep and surprise. She offered a small, uncertain smile. "Hi, Henry." He looked down at himself, at his wrinkled clothes, the snow-dusted boots, the truck behind him. "What are you doing here?" "I came to find you," she said simply. He frowned, crossing his arms. "Why?" She hesitated. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about what you did, about the kind of person who gives his only coat to a stranger." Henry gave a bitter laugh. "You didn't have to track me down for that. A thank you card would have done the job." "It's not about thanks," she said. "It's about not letting something good disappear without being seen." For a long moment, they stood in silence. Two people from different worlds brought together by an unlikely act in a bitter wind. Henry finally exhaled. "You came all this way just for that?" Claire nodded. "Yes, and maybe something more." The next time Claire saw Henry, he was bent over a stack of cinder blocks at a construction site on the edge of Queens. She had waited in her car for 20 minutes, watching from a distance as he moved steadily, silently, hauling, stacking, lifting and abiding coal with the quiet resolve of a man used to being overlooked. He wore a worn flannel shirt, His sleeves rolled his forearms despite the chill, and his breath puffed out in visible clouds. His hands were calloused, nails dirty, but his movements were precise, efficient, purposeful. When he took his break and sat on a low wall with a plastic water bottle in hand, Claire stepped out of the car and walked toward him. Henry looked up and did a double take. He stood quickly, brushing dust from his pants. "Claire." "Hi again," she said, her smile small, genuine. "What are you doing here?" She handed him a cup of coffee she'd brought with her. "Thought you might like something warm." He took it hesitantly, his eyes searching hers. "You really didn't have to." "I know, but I wanted to." They stood in silence for a beat before she added, "Would you come with me just for a bit? I'd like to show you something." Henry looked down at his work boots, then back at the foreman in the distance. "I've still got a few hours on shift." "I already spoke to him," Claire said. "Told him you had an interview." His brows raised. "I don't have an interview." "You do now," she replied. Henry let out a short laugh, more surprised and amused. "Okay, let's see what this is about." They drove in silence. Henry glanced out the window, fidgeting occasionally, conscious of his appearance. Dusty jeans, rough hands, the faint trace of sweat on his collar. Claire didn't seem to notice. When they arrived at Infinity Group's downtown headquarters, Henry hesitated in the marble-floored lobby, eyeing the massive glass walls, the polished chrome, the endless buzz of people in suits. "I don't belong here," he said under his breath. Claire turned to him. "Just come upstairs." They entered a private conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the skyline. Claire offered him a seat, then closed the door and sat across from him. Henry cleared his throat. "So what's all this about? Returning the coat?" Claire shook her head. "No, this isn't about the coat. I kept that. It's mine now." Henry blinked. "Okay." She leaned forward. "I didn't come to thank you. I came because you made me remember something I forgot. A version of myself I had buried under years of boardrooms and deadlines. You reminded me that real change doesn't always start with innovation or strategy. Sometimes it starts with kindness." Henry looked down. "Claire, I'm just a guy trying to survive. And that's exactly why I brought you here." She slid a folder across the table to him. Inside was a job proposal, a contract, a new position, cultural and human values advisor. Henry frowned as he flipped through the pages. "What is this?" "It's a new role, one I created. Someone who sits in on department decisions, training programs, development discussions, not to talk numbers or strategy, but people, values, compassion. You'd share your experiences, help shape the heart of this company." Henry laughed awkwardly, shaking his head. "Claire, look at me. I don't have a degree in psychology. I didn't graduate from Harvard. I sleep in a truck. You were an engineer. I haven't built anything in years." "You built a moment I'll never forget," Claire said softly. Henry looked away, overwhelmed. "This isn't charity," she continued. "This is a role only you can fill. You know what it's like to be invisible, to be passed over, and yet you stopped in the cold and gave your only coat to a stranger. That tells me more about leadership than any resume ever could. He opened his mouth, closed it, struggled for words. I'm not qualified, he said finally, voice low. Claire leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. You don't need a degree to teach people how to care, because you live it every day. Claire looked directly into his eyes and said, You don't need credentials to teach people how to be kind, because you've lived it, and that's more powerful than anything you'll ever put on paper. Henry's throat tightened. He stared down at the proposal, then back at her, and for the first time in years, he felt something flicker inside him. Not fear, not defeat, but hope. Raw, unfamiliar, terrifying hope. Henry sat alone on the bench outside the towering office building, the job proposal resting unread in his lap. His fingers ran along the edges of the folder, but his eyes stared off into the busy street, unfocused. He couldn't do it. It wasn't that he didn't want to. Somewhere deep down he did, but fear gripped him tight and familiar, the kind that whispered cruel things late at night. She's just being nice. This isn't real. You'll mess it up. You always do. The offer felt like a trap wrapped in kindness. And Henry, who had spent years learning to distrust anything that seemed too good to be true, couldn't shake the weight of doubt. He didn't see Claire step out of the building and walk toward him until she sat beside him in silence. You haven't opened it, she said softly. Henry gave a dry chuckle. Didn't think I needed to. I already know how this ends. Claire tilted her head. How? Someone like me doesn't end up in a place like this. You don't build a company like Infinity by hiring people who sleep in trucks. You think I made you an offer out of pity? I think I don't belong in your world. Claire looked ahead for a moment, then stood. Come with me just for an hour, Claire. No suits, no meetings, just trust me. Against his instincts, he stood. They drove in silence for over 30 minutes away from the city's shining towers and into a quieter part of town. Finally, they pulled up in front of a modest red brick building with a faded green awning. A painted sign read, Thomas's Place, a safe space for every child. Henry followed her inside. The walls were bright, covered in handprints, painted animals, quotes about kindness. The air smelled faintly of crayons and warm bread. Laughter echoed from down the hall, high, joyous, unfiltered children. Claire led him past the community kitchen, a reading room, into a wide playroom filled with second-hand toys and handmade posters. Kids of all ages were sprawled across the floor, building puzzles, reading, playing. This place, Claire said quietly, was named after the man who saved me. Henry looked at her. I grew up in foster homes, bounced around. Some were kind, some weren't. One night, I ran away. It was freezing. I was 12. I curled up outside a church, just waiting for morning. She paused. Her voice softened. He found me, an old man named Thomas. He gave me his coat, sat with me all night, didn't ask questions, just stayed. Henry didn't speak. He couldn't. I never saw him again. Claire continued. But that moment, it was like someone reached into the darkness and said, You matter. I built this place because of him. She turned to face Henry fully. And last week someone else gave me a coat. Didn't know who I was. Didn't ask for anything. Just gave. Henry swallowed hard. You remind me of him, she said. Not because of what you gave me, but because of who you are. They stood in silence, surrounded by the sounds of life and laughter. Henry's eyes wandered across the room at the children playing, a volunteer tying a shoelace, a young boy reading aloud with too much energy. It felt warm, real. Claire touched his arm gently. I don't need you to fit in a boardroom. Henry, I need you to remind people of this, of what it means to care. Henry didn't respond, not with words. His eyes were wet now. He looked down, trying to blink them away, but they came anyway, quiet, unguarded tears. And then he nodded, not for the job, not for the salary or the title, but because for the first time in years, he felt it. He was still needed, still useful, still human. Henry stood motionless in the center of a room full of joy and laughter, a single tear trailing down his weathered face, not out of sadness, but from profound relief of realizing he still mattered. Henry's first day at Infinity Group didn't start with fanfare. There was no welcome party, no press release, just a quiet meeting in a small glass-walled room on the 5th floor with a few skeptical department heads and a stack of sticky notes. Claire had introduced him simply. This is Henry Miles. He's here to help us build something more meaningful than just profit. The looks were polite but uncertain. But Henry didn't flinch. He began by sharing his story. Not the sob version, not the headline-grabbing kind, just pieces, honest pieces. What it felt like to lose everything, to wake up in a freezing truck, to walk into job interviews, knowing your shoes had holes to choose kindness. Anyway, at first they listened with cautious curiosity. By the end of that first week, they were leaning forward. Henry had a way of speaking that didn't preach or perform. He asked questions that made people pause. When was the last time you really looked someone in the eye? Do you know the name of the janitor who cleans this floor? What would you do if you saw someone crying in the break room? He didn't come in with charts or data. He came in with empathy. Slowly, a shift began. One by one, employees started seeking him out. First, the interns, then junior developers, then department heads. Some came to talk about stress, others about burnout. A few came just to sit quietly during lunch. Henry listened, and when he spoke, he didn't offer solutions. He offered perspective. You're not broken, he once told a young programmer who confessed he hadn't slept in 3 days. You're just tired. Being tired doesn't mean you're weak. It means you've cared for too long without someone caring back. That line ended up taped to office doors, printed on mugs, quoted in all company emails. Claire watched it all unfold from her corner office. She saw how break room chatter changed, how laughter returned, how productivity rose, not because of pressure, but because people felt seen. It wasn't long before Henry had an official space of his own. Small, cozy, filled with plants, secondhand books, and a coffee pot that never seemed to empty. Outside of work, life began to rebuild in quiet, meaningful ways. With Clay, Ree's help, and a small housing stipend from the company, Henry was able to put a down payment on a modest one-bedroom house on the edge of Brooklyn. It wasn't much, but it had a porch, a garden plot, and walls that didn't rattle in the wind. More importantly, it had room for Noah. Now, in his first year at a local university, Noah had moved back in with his father. Their first dinner in the new house was simple, spaghetti and garlic bread. But Henry would remember it for the rest of his life. You kept your promise, Noah had said that night, tearing up. Henry hadn't answered. He couldn't, not with words. But the look in his eyes said everything. As for Claire, she and Henry saw each other nearly every day. At first, it was about work, meetings, strategies, collaboration. Then, without trying, it became more. They started eating lunch together, then walking to the subway together. Then weekend coffees turned into evenings spent watching old movies, talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fast. It just happened. They were two people who had spent years building armor around themselves only to find comfort in the quiet company of someone who didn't ask for anything but presence. One late afternoon, as they stood on the rooftop of the building, watching the sunset behind the skyline, Claire said softly, "You've changed this place, Henry." He chuckled. "No, I just reminded them what they already knew." She looked at him and reminded me, too. Henry had just finished a workshop on resilience when a young man lingered after everyone else had left. He looked no older than 22, skinny pale, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. "I just want to say something," he said, voice shaking. "Last month I was going to quit. Everything life. I was done. But then I heard you speak and it stopped me." Henry stood still, heart pounding. "You said something about how people don't need to be fixed. They just need to be heard. No one had ever said that to me before. It felt like someone finally saw me." The young man swallowed hard. "If it weren't for you, I don't think I'd be here." Henry's chest tightened. He stepped forward and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "I'm really glad you are." After the young man left, Henry sat down in his chair, the room suddenly quiet, the words echoing in his mind. He had once wondered if he'd ever matter again. Now he had his answer. The atrium of Infinity Group had never looked like this before. Gone were the banners of quarterly achievements and product launches. In their place hung soft white drapes, strings of warm lights, and a massive sign that read in elegant lettering, One Kindness Day. Employees stood shoulder to shoulder, dressed in their best, not for business, but for something far more meaningful. On the center stage, Claire Langston stepped up to the podium, her eyes sweeping across the room. This day isn't about metrics, she began. It's about moments. The room quieted. A year ago, I was standing at a bus stop in the freezing cold, alone, tired, and more lost than I realized. And then, a man whom I had never met did something no one else had that night. He gave me his coat. A murmur of recognition stirred through the crowd. Claire smiled softly. It was old, worn, but it was everything because it reminded me that kindness, real kindness, doesn't wait until it's convenient. It shows up when the world least expects it. She turned to the easel beside her and removed the cloth draped over it. There, behind a glass frame, was the very same coat, frayed at the sleeves, faded from years of use, but preserved like something sacred. Beneath it, engraved on a bronze plaque, read the words, One small act of kindness can rewrite a life. Claire's voice wavered slightly. That act didn't just change my night. It changed the course of my life. And today, we honor not just that moment, but the man who made it possible. She turned toward the edge of the stage. Henry, will you come up here? Henry stood slowly from his seat, dressed in a simple suit, borrowed from a friend, but pressed with care. He made his way through the applause. His face, still lined with time and hardship, now carried something lighter, something peaceful. He stepped up beside her. Claire reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope. This belongs to you, she said. Henry opened it. Inside was the title deed to his new house, stamped and official. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Claire leaned in with a smile. No more sleeping in trucks. The room erupted in applause once again, but Henry held up a hand. I actually have something too, he said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. From it, he pulled out a small box, simple, worn, clearly held onto for some time. He looked at Claire, heart pounding. You said this coat changed your life, but you changed mine. Gave me back my name, my son, a roof and hope. He opened the box. Inside was a silver ring, not flashy, but shining Etley under the lights. I kept it in the pocket, he said, voice trembling. Because if there's anything more valuable than this coat, it's you. Claire stared at him, eyes filling. Claire Langston, will you marry me? A beat of stillness. Then she laughed, a soft, choked, beautiful sound, and nodded through tears. Yes, of course. Yes. The crowd rose in a standing ovation, cheers and claps bouncing off the high glass ceiling. 1 month later, they were married. The wedding wasn't held in a grand ballroom or a 5-star resort. It took place at Thomas's place, the little red brick community center that meant the world to them both. Children made paper flowers. The chairs didn't match. The cake was baked by one of the interns from Henry's mentorship program, but the room glowed with something money couldn't buy. Claire wore a simple white dress, her hair loose. Henry once again wore that same suit. Noah stood at his side as best man. The guests were volunteers, co-workers, people from shelters, and dozens of young employees who once sat in Henry's tiny office, searching for purpose. During the vows, Claire held Henry's hands and looked into his eyes. Once you gave me a coat, she said, her voice clear and sure. Tonight, I give you my whole life. Her words fell over the room like sunlight through a stained glass window. Soft, radiant, unforgettable. Henry couldn't speak. He just nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks as the crowd around them dabbed at their eyes. Laughter followed, music played. The reception spilled out into the courtyard where children ran barefoot, and strings of fairy lights danced in the twilight. Someone snapped a photo. Henry and Claire stood beneath the sign of Thomas's place. Side by side, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her, and beside them on an easel, stood the old coat, silent, worn, and now immortalized. That image would go on to circulate online. Shared, reposted, and talked about. A symbol not just of second chances, but of how something as simple as kindness could reach into the cold and rewrite everything. Sometimes the smallest gesture, A coat, a smile, a kind word can echo further than we ever imagined. Henry didn't have much, but he gave what he could, and in return, he didn't just change Claire's life. He found love, purpose, and a new beginning. Their story reminds us all kindness doesn't require perfection, just presence, just heart. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that hope still lives in unexpected places, please share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories. Here we tell the tales that warm the heart, restore your faith in humanity, and remind us what truly matters. Until next time, stay kind and keep believing.